This is the reason Kishibe isn't in part 2. It's weird because everyone likes Kishibe. He was fairly popular in part 1, so it makes you wonder why Fujimoto wouldn't continue to use him in part 2. But then you remember what he's been doing to every character. Since part 2 started, Fujimoto has been adding new faces. New MC, new devil to possess said MC, new friend to that MC. So it's easy enough to imagine why he'd replace Kishibe. If we're replacing old characters, who better than the old guy? But there's also some not new faces like Yoshida, and Yoshida has sort of become the Kishibe of part 2. But it makes you wonder why Fujimoto would want to use him to act as the new Kishibe, not considering the fact that he was an instant fan favorite in part 1. To understand why he's using Yoshida to fill Kishibe's role in the story, first we have to understand what that role is. There's actually another reason why he's using Yoshida that makes him better than Kishibe, but we'll get to that later in the video. Now, Kishibe's role in part 2 actually has two parts. The first part is his role as the face of public safety. Admittedly, this was kind of Makima's job as Denji's boss and the one who masterminded all the plans and missions. But we knew by the end of it that she was never acting in the interest of public safety. She answered to her superiors, but Makima basically did whatever she wanted. Kishibe, on the other hand, was the true face of public safety. We don't know Makima's full backstory, but we do know that Kishibe started working for public safety when he was a young man, so he's spent most of his life working there. And later on, when Makima went crazy, Kishibe was the one to try and stop her, and he was the one who helped Denji in the newly discovered Nuyuta. Kishibe might not be the one making the top decisions, but he's been with the department the longest and his motivations align with their goals. Or at the very least, he tries to keep everyone in public safety from becoming as depressed as he is. And this brings us to the second part of his role, not just as the face of public safety, but as a mentor to everyone there. Obviously, he trained some of the Devil Hunters, as we saw with Power and Denji, but he also counsels the younger generations and gives them his 2 cents. His very first introduction was meeting with Himeno after her friend died. It was funny in a messed up kind of way, because instead of just being like, hey man, it'll be alright, he was like, well, duh, of course they died. He also looks out for Aki and meets with him, and of course he looks out for Denji as well, which kind of explains why he's not really in the story anymore. Kishibe is the face of public safety, but as a mentor, he's never really in the front lines of the story until later in part 1. And even considering those parts, he's mostly in the background. So keeping in theme with part 2, where Fujimoto takes the same role, gives it to a new character, and gives it a new twist, this is where we come to Yoshida. Actually, before I do that, make sure to like the video if you've been enjoying it so far. It's the easiest way to support the channel, and it helps spread the video to other viewers like you. Now, let's go back to our original question. Why would Fujimoto replace Kishibe with Yoshida? Well, first of all, we have to remember that everyone in part 1 was in public safety, and Kishibe was mentoring public safety members. Asa is not a public safety member, so it wouldn't really make a whole lot of sense for someone like Kishibe to be mentoring her. This is where Yoshida is a very simple fix. By giving Yoshida a more active role in the story than Kishibe, he runs into Asa much earlier in the story, and is thus able to interact with her on a somewhat regular basis. But that brings us to the question of, well, does he really mentor her? And admittedly, this is where Yoshida doesn't exactly fit into the role. He never really mentors Asa at all. In fact, I'm pretty sure he even calls her senpai, but don't quote me on that. And in terms of Denji, he definitely doesn't mentor him like Kishibe did. All he really does is try to stop Denji from being too reckless. But I wouldn't exactly call that mentoring. That's more like, dude, quit being dumb. Evidently, you can't really call Yoshida a mentor per se. He does try to influence Asa and Denji, but he doesn't really advise them. But where he feels more like Kishibe is his role as the face of public safety. Without Yoshida, public safety would basically be non-existent in part 2. Obviously there's no Makima, but there's also no Kishibe, at least right now. There's no Aki, there's no Himeno, and there's no Kobeni. And there's no new public safety hunters as far as we know. I actually thought about this for a while, thinking about why there isn't as much of a presence in part 2, and I think it's to leave more of a sense of chaos. The devils are supposed to be more on the loose in part 2, so this is accomplished by not having as many public safety hunters in the front lines of the story. Of course, this means that the one we do meet has to pick up the pace, which explains why Yoshida has a more active role in the story. Of course, he's younger than Kishibe and more capable of taking on missions, but he's taken on a bit of leadership now that there aren't as many devil hunters left. And this is exactly what he does. Need a devil hunter at Asa and Denji's school? That's Yoshida. Need someone to keep try to keep Denji in line? That's Yoshida. Need someone to confront the famine devil and try and protect the country from the apocalypse? That's also Yoshida. So where he lacks in the mentoring other characters thing, Yoshida makes up for it by serving as a much more active participant in the story than Kishibe. It makes sense because he's pretty young. He has a lot of experience as a devil hunter, but he's a bit too young to be like, "Hey you youngsters, be careful, you're gonna hurt yourselves." There's also another reason he's much different from Kishibe. Remember earlier in the video when I said there's something that actually makes Yoshida better than Kishibe? Well, that is the sense of uncertainty and suspense he adds to the story. You could use the word mystery, but that's not entirely accurate, because there is mystery around Kishibe. We don't know his entire backstory, so we don't know his exact motivations and fears. But he doesn't really add uncertainty to the story. Practically speaking, Kishibe is a straightforward character. Straightforward in the sense that he's a pretty transparent character. We know he wants to look out for the other characters, we know he serves public safety, and practically speaking, we're never given any reason to question any of that. This is where Yoshida is a much more interesting character. Not a better character, not necessarily better, so don't blast my comment section, just more interesting. Because from my perspective, there have been more theories, more comments, more questions about Yoshida than any other character in Part 2 besides maybe Asa. Questions like, is Yoshida the fake Chainsaw Man? Is he the Death Devil? Is he just a red herring? All of this is because of his portrayal in Part 2. Well, his portrayal in general, actually. Because let's go back to Part 1. Yoshida is properly introduced in the assassination arc. In that arc, he shows up, creepily takes down one of the mercenary brothers, is shown to have a mysterious devil, and is somehow able to fight one-on-one with Quan Chi. Naturally, people are like, who is this dude? So we already had that sense of uncertainty around the character. Then you have him just randomly showing up in Part 2 for no apparent reason. He confronts Denji, tells him to keep his identity a secret, and he says he represents a group without actually naming the group. Then he gives this ambiguous look to the famine devil of all people, giving people even more reason to question his motives. Then we have the bird showing up around Yuko's death, just like how Makima could use animals, making us wonder if Yoshida is somehow doing the same thing. So at every step, Yoshida has somehow made us more uncertain about the story, and we needed a new character for this. I know Yoshida isn't brand new, but he's a younger character we haven't really spent time with, and don't know all that much about. You can't really do this with a character like Kishibe because we've seen part of his past and we know what he's about. This is something unique to Yoshida that he adds to the story. He's not as much of a mentor, but he is very much the face of public safety in Part 2. He takes a much more active role in the story, and by doing so gives readers more questions to think about throughout the story. As a result, we pay more attention to everything he does, as well as the small details that seem uncertain. It's for this exact reason that Yoshida was the perfect character to replace Kishibe in Part 2. But maybe you disagree. Do you think Kishibe will keep his role and return in Part 2? Do you like Yoshida better? Share your thoughts and say what everyone else has to say down in the comments. I'll pick my favorite and share it as comment of the week on my community tab. And if you'd like another discussion like this one, then make sure to check out my recent video on why Asa replaced Denji. In that video, I explain why Fujimoto created a new main character for Part 2. You can find that video in the playlist linked right here. Until then, thank you for watching, and I hope to hear from you soon.